20th century warfare has seen camouflage become an essential part of the soldier's armory. Camouflage primarily protects through helping concealment. It's designed to blend in equipment and men with the terrain over which they're operating. During 1914-18, ships at sea did the same, but some also used camouflage to deceive the enemy. These vessels were seemingly innocent merchant ships, whose true purpose was to hunt submarines or sink other merchant ships. The Great War was the first in which the submarine was extensively used. The German submarines, or U-boats, quickly made their presence felt when U-9 sank 3 elderly British cruisers in the space of minutes in the early weeks of the war. This provoked increasing concern over the threat to British ships carrying troops and supplies across to France. Surface ships were having no success in hunting the U-boats, and so in November 1914, another method was tried. Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, ordered the arming of a small steamer in order to trap a U-boat. In early 1915, the situation grew more serious when the Germans instituted unrestricted submarine warfare. This meant that merchant vessels would now be attacked without warning. The aim was to deter neutral ships from entering British waters. Soon, the numbers of merchant ships falling victim to U-boats began to rise at an alarming rate. One British answer was to fit out more merchant vessels with camouflaged armament. They became known as mystery or Q ships, the latter because many of them operated from the Irish port of Queenstown, now Cove, and patrolled the western approaches to Britain. The usual U-boat tactic was to sink merchantmen with its guns, since it only carried a few torpedoes and preferred to save these for attacks on warships. That the U-boat had to surface to do this made it vulnerable to attack, and it was on this that the Q-ships relied. The existence of the Q-ships was kept highly secret until almost the end of the war. They were manned by Royal Navy crews disguised as merchant seamen. Many types of vessel were used as Q-ships, patrolling the Eastern Atlantic, North Sea and Mediterranean for up to 14 days at a time. Others, seemingly innocent fishing smacks, acted as escorts to the fishing fleets, which played such a vital part in keeping Britain supplied with food. The Germans ended their unrestricted U-boat campaign after neutral America had complained about deaths to its citizens, but they resumed it in 1917 on an even wider scale than before, and an even higher rate of sinkings resulted. The British now sailed their merchant vessels in convoys guarded by warships. Q-ships often straggled at the rear to tempt U-boats. In most cases, they tried to disguise themselves as a specific vessel from a neutral country, using Lloyd's Register of Shipping as a reference. One ploy was for a Q-ship to act in concert with a submarine, literally towing it, and with a telephone line rigged between the two. This technique accounted for the first 2 Q-ship successes in the summer of 1915. When they spotted U-boats on the surface, they alerted their underwater consorts, who then destroyed the prey with torpedoes. Another tactic needed a steady nerve. This was to sail or steam in an area where U-boats were known to be operating. When a U-boat was spotted on the surface, the Q-ship's crew pretended to panic, and some would take to the boats. Once they had done so, and the U-boat was within range, the Q-ship's guns would be unmasked, the white ensign hoisted to show that she was a Royal Navy ship, and fire opened. Another way of catching a U-boat unawares was to sail to the rescue of a ship that had been attacked by it. This brought about the most controversial Q-ship incident of the war. It involved the Q-ship Baralong and took place in August 1915 off the southwest coast of Ireland. Baralong's captain was ex-submariner Commander Godfrey Herbert. He heard on his radio that the steamship Nicotian was being threatened by a U-boat. He was also aware that a U-boat had sunk the liner Arabic in the same area earlier in the day and quickly made for the scene. Baralong caught the U-boat on the surface and crippled her. Some of the U-boat's crew made for the Nicotian and boarded her. Herbert sent over his own boarding party, which killed the Germans below decks. Accused by the Germans of a war crime, his defense was that he thought the Nicotian would be scuttled. During 1916, the U-boats refined their tactics and began to hunt down the Q-ships, sinking a number of them. The Germans also replaced the U-boat's 88mm guns with more powerful 105s. This enabled them to engage at longer ranges and to outgun the Q-ships. Furthermore, the U-boats began to use torpedoes much more frequently and became adept at spotting the telltale signs of disguised guns on a Q-ship's hull and superstructure. Out of the 145 U-boats sunk during the war, the Q-ship's share was a mere 11. It has also been claimed that the Q-ship's activities provoked the U-boats into a policy of firing first and asking questions afterwards. Even so, they undoubtedly helped to make life more difficult for the U-boats, and many more merchant vessels would have been sunk without their presence. Certainly the Q-ships played their part in the Allied victory at sea. Their crews could share in the pleasure of the final surrender of the U-boats immediately after the end of the war in November 1918. Disguised merchant vessels were also used offensively in both world wars as commerce raiders, especially by the Germans. At the outbreak of the Great War in August 1914, they had a number of armed liners, but none survived for long. They then employed some converted freighters, the most successful of which was the Merve. During her first cruise in the winter of 1915-16, she accounted for 14 Allied ships. Most of these, including an elderly British battleship, fell victim to minefields which she laid. A year later, the Merve undertook a second cruise. Disguised as a neutral Swedish vessel, she managed to get into the Atlantic and was soon enjoying success. She used her guns to force vessels to heave to. She then sent a boarding party to take possession of the ship. Sometimes a ship was scuttled, her crew being placed on board Merve. If the cargo was useful, the vessel was sent back to Germany with a prize crew. When Merve returned to port, she could boast that she had bagged 25 ships, representing over 120,000 tons. Thereafter, convoying frustrated the commerce raiders, and they enjoyed few further successes during the Great War. In spite of the success of the Merve and other commerce raiders, Germany in 1939 had no armed vessels among its merchant fleet of 250 ships over 5,000 tons. Indeed, German surface attacks on Allied shipping were initially carried out by major warships. These included pocket battleships like the Graf Spee and Admiral Scheer. The German Naval High Command did, however, set about converting 12 merchant vessels to commerce raiders. Typical of them was the Atlantis, seen here disguised as a Norwegian vessel. Her main armament was 6 150mm guns, and her crew numbered 350 men. The commerce raiders also carried spotter aircraft for locating potential targets. Some could also be used as mine layers. Atlantis herself carried 92 mines, but other commerce raiders carried many more. The commerce raiders began to operate in spring 1940. Atlantis was the first to sail, disguised as a Soviet merchant vessel on the 31st of March. Amid heavy seas, she managed to evade British warships to reach her patrol area in the South Atlantic, where she sank her first victim, a vessel bound from Durban, South Africa, to London on the 3rd of May. Of the other 5 commerce raiders which made up the first wave, Comet had the most remarkable voyage. She sailed north from Bergen, Norway, on the 9th of July, 1940. She aimed to get into the Pacific via the Northeast Passage and Bering Strait. But Comet first called into Murmansk, where she met up with a Soviet icebreaker. This helped her to negotiate the still partially icebound Northeast Passage. Once in the Pacific, Comet began to wreak havoc in the sea lanes. One vessel after another fell victim to her guns. Another raider, Penguin, had sailed from Germany on the 22nd of June 1940, the very day that the French laid down their arms. She followed the more conventional Atlantic route. Under the command of Captain Felix Kruder, she had orders to operate in the Indian Ocean, off Australia, and in Antarctica. She also carried 300 mines, which were to be laid off Australia and the west coast of India. By early July, she was deep in the Atlantic. But even though she was on a long and hazardous mission, the crew was still able to enjoy the crossing of the line ceremony. All those whose first crossing of the equator this was underwent their initiation at the hands of King Neptune. It was a brief but welcome respite from the tension they were under. Penguin made her first contact off Ascension Island on the 31st of July, when she came across the British vessel Domingo de la Reinaga. Penguin's guns made short work of this vessel. As for the crew, they were taken on board the commerce raider. Entering the Indian Ocean, Penguin sank a Norwegian tanker. Further successes quickly followed. The British, thoroughly alarmed, mounted extensive air searches for both Penguin and Atlantis, which was also now in the Indian Ocean. But both raiders were undeterred. Penguin used her torpedoes, another weapon in her armory, to sink another ship on the 12th of September 1940. Penguin then headed for Australia. By now she had collected a large number of prisoners, and so Captain Kruder decided to send them back to Germany in another Norwegian tanker which he had just captured. Kruder then began laying mines off Australia's east coast, between Newcastle and Sydney, and then further south, off Hobart, Tasmania. Among the early victims of these mines was the first American vessel to be sunk during the Second World War, the merchantman City of Raven. This over a year before the United States would enter the war. Penguin enjoyed further successes off Australia, including capturing another vessel and converting it into an auxiliary mine layer. By the end of November 1940, Kruder's tally was 11 ships sunk or captured. Once more, his own vessel was becoming overcrowded with prisoners, and so he dispatched 400 to Germany in another captured vessel. Penguin now entered the ice floes of Antarctica. Her target was a Norwegian whaling fleet operating in these waters. Kruder captured one whaler after another. None had the wherewithal to offer any resistance. Soon, Penguin held no less than 14 whalers in her charge. But the British had been steadily locating and sinking the German supply vessels on which the raiders relied. The vast majority of merchant ships now sailed in convoy, and those that did not kept well away from the main sea lanes. More warships were deployed. The extensive air patrols were making it more difficult for the commerce raiders to remain undetected. Kruder therefore decided to make a brief foray back into the Indian Ocean and then withdraw, having hopefully disrupted maritime traffic there. En route, Penguin passed the pocket battleship Admiral Scheer, which was also on a successful cruise against commerce. Entering the Indian Ocean, Captain Kruder put in at a remote island. His crew were able to stretch their legs after so long at sea. But more important was to replenish Penguin's severely depleted stocks of fresh water. A system of hoses was used to transport the water to the ship. Once this replenishment was completed, Penguin could put to sea once more. On the 25th of April 1941, Penguin located the 6,800-ton Empire Light en route from Madras, India to Durban. Once again, her guns loosed off salvos and sent this ship to the bottom of the ocean. Kruder was encouraged, and 3 days later, Penguin's remaining seaplane located another vessel. This was also sunk after the crew had taken to their lifeboats. On the 7th of May, the seaplane spotted a tanker near the entrance to the Persian Gulf. Penguin engaged her. But the crew had sent a distress signal, which was picked up by the British cruiser HMS Cornwall. She set off to the scene of Penguin's latest triumph. At last, after months of fruitless patrolling, Cornwall's crew scented possible success. The cruiser's Walrus amphibian was launched. It came across Penguin, now disguised as a Norwegian vessel, and radioed back to Cornwall. The cruiser now raced to intercept the German raider. Cornwall's challenge produced no satisfactory response, and Cruden knew he could not escape. He therefore hoisted his battle ensign, thus displaying his true colours. Penguin's guns were unmasked, and she opened fire on the cruiser. Cornwall replied with her 8-inch guns. The two ships blazed away at one another. But Cornwall's superior firepower began to tell. Penguin was hit, but fought on. It was to no avail, as further shells struck her. Cruden ordered his men to abandon ship, and those that survived were picked up by Cornwall's crew. Cruden refused to leave the now blazing Penguin as the rescue operation continued. Penguin succumbed to her wounds, taking Cruden down with her. 5 months later, Cornwall's sister ship, HMS Devonshire, accounted for the raider Atlantis, which had been at sea for no less than 622 days. Her tally of 22 ships was only 3 less than that of Penguin. Cormorant, another commerce raider, also came to grief in November 1941. But her assailant, the Australian cruiser Sydney, got too close to the raider's guns and was also sunk. Other commerce raiders set out, but the odds were now against them, for the Allies were beginning to establish naval superiority in the world's oceans. British destroyers accounted for Comet in October 1942. At the start of her second cruise. RAF bombers set off and attacked the German raider Togo while she was sheltering in the French Channel port of Dunkirk in February 1943. She was damaged in this attack, but managed to limp back to Germany. In the Pacific and Indian Oceans, aircraft carriers posed a further threat. But it was the American submarine Tarpon which accounted for Michelle, the last of the commerce raiders to be sunk, while she was en route to Japan in October 1943. Thus, one by one, the German commerce raiders met their end. Yet in 3 years, they had sunk or captured over 500,000 tons of shipping. Operating far from friendly ports, the crews of the commerce raiders had a lonely war. Yet they did so with a sense of adventure and in the belief that they were playing their full part in their country's struggle. Likewise, the crews of the Great War British Q-ships also required a cool nerve for their often hazardous war against the U-boats. Both types of vessel were true wolves in sheep's clothing.